The first smell came before the screams. It drifted down Chartres Street like a secret no one wanted to name. Sweet, heavy, metallic. It clung to the air above the French Quarter butcher shop owned by Jean Moreau, a man with a smile too polite and a wife too quiet. In the heat of an 1891 New Orleans summer, the stench of death was nothing new. But this one was different. People whispered that it smelled like pork, only richer, darker. And when the first body disappeared, no one thought to look in the barrels behind the Moreau's shop. They called her Celeste Moreau, a woman with eyes like fogged glass and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper. To the neighbors, she was nothing more than the butcher's dutiful wife, sweeping the stoop each morning, humming hymns she half remembered. But inside that narrow two-room home above the shop, something began to rot long before the meat did. The screams that echoed behind closed shutters weren't from pigs or cattle. They were from husbands, debtors, and drifters who never made it out once Celeste started to help her husband with his special cuts. But before we continue this disturbing story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves hidden stories. It helps bring more of these untold truths to light. By the late 19th century, New Orleans was a city both sacred and wicked, a place where the air itself seemed to hum with vice. The scent of molasses, blood, and river rot rose from the Mississippi, mixing with the perfume of magnolias and whiskey-soaked laughter. Prostitutes and priests shared the same streets, and men who sinned by night sought forgiveness by dawn. The French Quarter, narrow and dimly lit, was its beating heart, full of markets, music, and shadows where no man wanted to wander after dusk. It was here, at 741 Chartres Street, that Jean Moreau's butcher shop had become something of a local staple. Jean was a proud man, thick hands, quick knife, faster smile. His cuts were famous, tender, marbled, always fresh. The sailors loved him. The priests too. Even the police captain would stop by every Friday to pick up his special sausage. They said Jean's secret was his seasoning, a blend of Creole spice and something he imported from up north. But as months went by, the shop's popularity grew, while the city's missing persons list quietly lengthened. Celeste had once been beautiful. Born to a Creole seamstress and a French sailor, she carried that soft melancholy of women who had seen more sea than sunlight. She met Jean when she was just 17, married him at 18, and by 21 had already begun to fade behind him. Those who spoke to her said she rarely smiled. She walked like a ghost, her hands always red from washing. Soap, blood, it was hard to tell which. Rumor had it, Jean was cruel. Not in public, there he was all charm and laughter. But in private, neighbors said they heard the dull thud of fists and the sharp sound of breaking glass. Celeste would appear the next morning with bruises hidden beneath lace and long sleeves, her eyes hollow. But she never complained. Not once. Then came the first disappearance. In March of 1891, a sailor named Thomas Leclerc was last seen drinking outside the Moreau shop. He'd owed Jean money, a small gambling debt, nothing serious. Witnesses said John invited him inside for a quick talk and a drink. The man was never seen again. Weeks later, Jean sold a new type of sausage that became the talk of the quarter. "Richer than anything I've ever tasted," said one regular. "Almost sweet," said another. John just smiled. But one person wasn't smiling. Celeste. She had begun to keep her distance from her husband, sleeping in a separate room. At night she heard him working, chopping, grinding, humming to himself. Sometimes she thought she heard words between the hums, sometimes laughter, and once when she came downstairs for water, she saw him standing before the grinder, whispering a name she didn't recognize. Thomas. Over time, Celeste began to see things. Shadows that lingered, reflections that moved slower than her own. She convinced herself it was the fever. The Louisiana heat could make anyone hallucinate. But one evening, while scrubbing the cutting table, she found something wedged in the groove of the wood. It was small, round, pale. When she pried it out, her hands trembled. It was a human tooth. Celeste wanted to scream, but she didn't. She placed it quietly in her apron and walked upstairs. That night she didn't sleep. By morning, she'd buried the tooth behind the shop, whispering a prayer she could barely remember. June, however, was thriving. Business was booming. Even the mayor's chef came by for orders. His meat was so soft, so flavorful, that people joked he must be blessed by the devil himself. Jean would laugh, a low, satisfied sound, and say, "The devil's been good to me." But beneath that laughter, Celeste saw something shifting. The way his eyes darted when customers asked where the cuts came from. The way he locked the storage room and kept the key around his neck, even while he slept. She began to suspect the unthinkable. One night, when thunder cracked over the city and the streets ran black with rain, she decided to find out. While Jean slept in his chair, drunk and snoring, Celeste took the key from around his neck. She lit a single candle and descended the stairs. The butcher shop was silent, except for the faint dripping of water from the ceiling. She unlocked the storage door. Inside, the smell was unbearable, sweet, rotting, familiar. Celeste lifted her candle, and what she saw made her knees buckle. Hooks lined the walls, but not all of them held pigs. In the far corner, beneath a tarp, lay what looked like a leg, shaved clean, pink, tied at the ankle. Next to it, in a bucket, were fingers, human fingers, some small, some large, all perfectly preserved. Celeste stumbled back, covering her mouth. The candle slipped, wax splashing across her wrist. Her scream caught in her throat, a strangled sound that died before it reached the air. For a long moment she stood frozen, the truth blooming in her chest like sickness. Jean had been feeding the town their own kind. She wanted to run, but her feet refused. Instead, she stared at the grinder, its steel mouth dripping red. On the table beside it sat a half-finished sausage, still slick and glistening, and next to it, a gold ring. It was engraved with the initials T.L. Thomas LeClaire. That night, Celeste didn't confront him. She didn't leave. She didn't tell a soul. She simply burned her clothes and washed her hands until her skin peeled. Something inside her had broken, not with fear, but with quiet understanding. Because deep down, she realized she had known all along. Days turned into weeks. John grew bolder. He began to laugh at supper, telling Celeste stories of the ungrateful city that mocked him, only to feast on his kindness. "They all eat," he'd say, "and they all forget. So I make them remember me, one bite at a time." Celeste no longer flinched at his words. Instead, she watched him, studying his hands, his habits, the way he sharpened his knife with almost religious devotion. Something had shifted in her eyes now, too. The fear was gone, replaced by something colder, calculating. She began helping again in the shop. Customers smiled, grateful to see her back. Celeste served them with a gentleness that hid her trembling fingers. Every slice, every weigh, every polite nod, all while her mind whispered, "You're eating him. You're eating her." She wondered if they'd ever notice. They didn't. They never did. By July, the disappearances became impossible to ignore. The local newspaper, the Picayune, ran a small piece. Fishermen missing near French Market, police investigating. But no one dared accuse Jean. His connections were strong, and his charm stronger. Even the inspector who came to question him left the shop carrying 2 pounds of meat and a smile. Celeste, however, was no longer the same woman. The silence between her and Jean had become something poisonous. She began slipping herbs into his food. Nothing deadly, just enough to keep him tired, slow. She watched him stumble more often, slur his words, forget his knives. She waited. Then came the day it all unraveled. A young woman named Elise Duval, daughter of a merchant, went missing. She'd been last seen near the Moreau shop. That same night, the police came with lanterns and warrants. Jean laughed, saying they'd find nothing. But when they searched the basement, Celeste didn't stop them. She just stood by the stairs, her face pale, her hands clasped like in prayer. They found everything. The hooks, the flesh, the bones, and in the center of it all, Jean, screaming that he'd been betrayed. Celeste didn't speak a word, not when they dragged him through the streets, not when they locked him in the parish jail, not even when he called her name, spitting blood and rage through the bars. She simply watched, and for the first time in years, she smiled. But that's not where the story ends. Because a week after Jean's arrest, people in the quarter began to whisper again. The shop had been closed, the doors sealed, yet the smell, That same heavy, sweet smell began to rise again from beneath the floorboards. When the landlord opened the cellar to clean it, he found something the police had missed. A second grinder, a second table, and a note, written in Celeste's hand. It read, "He taught me everything I know." The police thought it was over. They believed they had their monster, Jean Moreau, the butcher of Chartres Street, the man who fed the city its own flesh. His name flooded the headlines. Crowds gathered outside the jail every morning, hungry for a glimpse of the devil. But evil in New Orleans was never simple. It always came with a shadow, and Celeste Moreau was that shadow, silent, soft-spoken, and watching everything burn. When they found the note in her handwriting beneath the shop floorboards, the officers laughed uneasily. "He taught me everything I know." Some thought it was a confession. Others thought it was mockery. But to Inspector Armand Rousseau, it was something else entirely, a warning. He'd been first on the scene the night of Jean's arrest. He'd seen the basement, smelled that sweet, nauseating rot. And he'd seen Celeste standing there, white as the wax candles dripping beside her, her lips trembling not with fear, but with something like satisfaction. Rousseau was a veteran of the city's ugliest corners. He'd patrolled Storyville's brothels, seen gamblers stabbed on Dauphine Street, and drunks float face down in the river. But he had never forgotten the look in Celeste's eyes that night. So he ordered her brought in for questioning. Celeste didn't resist. She arrived at the station with her hair neatly pinned, her black dress spotless, her hands folded in her lap. She looked like a widow already deep in mourning. When Rousseau asked her if she knew what her husband had done, she nodded once and whispered, "I knew." Her voice was calm, almost detached, like she was describing someone else's dream. "You knew he was killing people?" Rousseau pressed. "I knew he was feeding them," she said. "Feeding who?" "Everyone." The silence that followed was suffocating. Over the next hours, her story began to unwind like old thread. She spoke slowly, with that eerie stillness that made even the clerk stop writing. She told them how Jean began bringing home extra meat after business hours, how he'd said it came from the docks, cheap stock no one wanted. She said she'd never asked questions, because questions in marriage were like cuts in a good steak, too many, and it falls apart. But Rousseau wasn't convinced. Her calmness disturbed him more than Jean's madness. Jean had screamed and cursed when arrested. Celeste simply watched. When he was dragged through the crowd, she didn't flinch. That wasn't ignorance. That was control. He ordered her to be held overnight. That night in her cell, Celeste slept. The matron said she didn't toss or cry or whisper. She simply folded her hands beneath her cheek and drifted off as if she'd been waiting for this peace for years. But while she slept, something strange began to happen outside. The city was restless. Crowds gathered at the jail gates, chanting for Jean's hanging. Vendors sold sausage rolls nearby, mocking the very horror that had stained their streets. The irony was unbearable, and in some perverse way, perfectly New Orleans. When morning came, word spread Jean Moreau had taken his own life. They found him hanging from the ceiling of his cell, the belt around his neck fashioned from the same leather strap he used to sharpen his knives. No note, no confession. Only silence, and one strange thing. His right hand clenched tight around a small scrap of paper, almost fused to his skin with dried blood. When they pried it open, it read in uneven scrawl, "She made me do it." The city erupted. The narrative shifted overnight, from the butcher of New Orleans to the butcher's wife. Papers ran her picture now, not his. The same woman who once stood invisible in the background was now painted as the mind behind the massacre. Celeste Moreau, the Black Widow of Chartres Street. Every rumor, every whisper fed the flames. Some said she'd seduced her husband into madness. Others said she'd continued his work after he was gone. Mothers kept their children close. Priests gave sermons about the serpent disguised as a wife. Rousseau, however, didn't rush to condemn. He watched her through the bars of the interrogation room. There was something about her that didn't fit the hysteria. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't proud either. She just existed. Quiet, polite, empty. When he asked her if she'd heard about her husband's death, she said, "He always finished what he started." Did you love him? Celeste smiled faintly. He was all I had, and that was the problem. Rousseau leaned forward. What do you mean? She looked past him, toward the window where the early light spilled in like weak gold. When you have nothing but one person, you start to disappear. I disappeared long before he did. Her words unsettled him. They didn't sound like guilt. They sounded like a confession of something far more complicated. A life consumed, digested, and forgotten. Rousseau decided to dig deeper. He sent men to search the Moreau home again, this time with precision. They found a hidden room, small, behind a false wall in the cellar. Inside were ledgers, notes, recipes, not just meat orders, but measurements. Liver, 3 lbs, salted. Shoulder, 8 lbs marinated. Heart, dried, powdered. And one entry dated months before the arrests. Celeste's batch, perfection. When confronted with this, Celeste didn't deny it. She simply said, he wanted to see if people could taste love. What does that mean? Rousseau demanded. It means, she said softly, that he only used those who wronged him. The gamblers, the thieves, the men who beat their wives. He said he was cleansing the city, feeding it what it deserved. And you helped him? She looked up then, eyes sharp for the first time. No, I learned from him. The words hit like a gunshot. From that point, there was no saving her in the public's eyes. The trial that followed became the most sensational event New Orleans had seen in decades. The courthouse overflowed. Vendors sold portraits of Celeste outside like saints' cards. Reporters described her as a woman of spectral grace, a widow without tears, the bride of the abattoir. She never once raised her voice in her defense. When the prosecutor asked, "Did you ever kill a man yourself?" She paused, smiled faintly, and said, "Not in the way you mean." The courtroom gasped. Some fainted. The judge banged his gavel, shouting for order. But Celeste remained still. In that stillness lay the terror of her. A woman who no longer feared the world, because she'd already eaten her part of it. As the trial dragged on, Rousseau began to feel something he hated: doubt. There were things that didn't fit. The notes, for instance, though signed by Jean, were written in 2 distinct hands. The hidden grinder, too small for the volume of victims claimed, and witnesses reported seeing a tall, thin man leaving the shop late at night even after Jean's arrest, someone wearing the same blood-stained apron. He wondered if perhaps Celeste wasn't the only one who'd learned from Jean. Then came the coroner's report. Jean's body showed signs of deep punctures along the arms and ribs, old scars and newer ones, as though someone had been testing knives on him for weeks. But he'd been in custody. Who could have done it? The guards swore no one touched him. Rousseau began to suspect the impossible, that the killing, the ritual, didn't end with Jean's death. It continued, and every path led back to Celeste. One evening, after the courthouse closed, Rousseau visited her cell alone. She was sitting by the small barred window, humming a tune he didn't recognize, low, mournful, and strangely beautiful. "You're not afraid of dying," he said. She turned her head slightly. "No, death's been in my house a long time. You know they'll hang you. They'll try." "What do you mean?" She smiled faintly. "They already ate the evidence." Rousseau felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What did you say?" She met his gaze directly for the first time. "They buried him in the wrong place," she whispered. "He isn't in the jail yard. They fed him to the same pigs he used to sell." That statement never appeared in any official record. Rousseau buried it in his notes, calling it delusion, but it haunted him for the rest of his career. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. Sentence, death by hanging. The crowd outside cheered as though it were Mardi Gras. Bells rang. The press rejoiced. But even as the judge read the sentence, Celeste stood serene. She bowed her head, whispered something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse, and walked from the courtroom in silence. The execution was set for November 13th, 1891. In the weeks leading up to it, something strange began happening across the French Quarter. People reported that meat from the local markets tasted strange, too sweet, too tender. Dogs refused to eat scraps. One tavern owner swore his sausage bled even after cooking. Superstition spread like mold. that Celeste had cursed the city's meat, that she'd whispered spells before each cut, binding the city to her hunger. Rousseau, now half mad from sleepless nights, visited her one final time. "Tell me," he demanded, "was it all true? The killings, the meat, the curse?" Celeste looked at him, her eyes glowing in the dim light. "Truth?" she murmured. "Truth is just what we swallow easiest." Then she leaned forward, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of iron on her breath. "I didn't curse the city, Inspector. The city cursed itself. We just gave it a taste of what it really was." The next morning, Rousseau requested transfer out of New Orleans. His request was denied. The night before her execution, the prison matron claimed to see Celeste standing at her cell door, whispering to the walls. When asked what she was doing, she said, "Saying grace." At dawn, the guards came. She walked calmly to the gallows, her black dress immaculate, her hair pinned with a single white flower, a magnolia, the city's emblem. The crowd jeered, spat, shouted prayers and curses alike. She didn't flinch. When asked for her final words, she smiled faintly. "You all taste the same." The trapdoor opened, but the story didn't end there. When the undertaker came to prepare her body, the sheets were stained with a dark, oily residue that smelled faintly of spice and iron. Her body temperature was still warm hours later, impossible by natural means. The undertaker, shaken, quit his job the next morning. The body was buried in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, the same cemetery that housed the city's most famous witch, Marie Laveau. Some said Celeste's grave never stayed sealed. Fresh soil appeared disturbed every full moon. A month later, Inspector Rousseau vanished. His home was found empty, the windows locked from inside. On his desk sat one thing, a dinner plate. On it, a single slice of sausage. Next to it, a note written in the same delicate hand as before. "He taught me everything I know." They buried Celeste Moreau on a gray morning when the rain refused to stop. The funeral was small. No family, no friends, only the undertaker, a priest, and 2 guards to make sure she stayed in the ground. Her coffin was cheap pine, hastily nailed shut, its surface already swelling with damp. The priest mumbled a prayer too quietly to hear. When it was done, the men turned to leave, but the undertaker lingered. He said he could still smell her, a sweetness that clung to his hands no matter how many times he washed them. By nightfall, the city pretended to breathe again. But New Orleans never forgot its dead, especially not the ones that had fed it. For weeks after her hanging, the French Quarter changed. It wasn't sudden, just a slow, sickly shift. The smell in the air thickened again, like summer rot. Butchers complained that their knives rusted overnight. The sausage turned sour within days. The stray dogs, once fat from scraps, began to vanish. Some said they'd seen figures in the alleys, pale, barefoot, with hands too thin, eyes too empty. And in every tavern, people whispered the same thing: "The butcher's wife isn't done yet." The newspapers dismissed it as hysteria, a city haunted by its own appetite. But Inspector Rousseau's disappearance turned superstition into obsession. When the police finally broke into his house, they found no struggle, just an uneaten meal, still warm, and that single slice of sausage with the note beside it. His pistol lay on the table. His chair was pushed back, as if he'd risen to answer a knock that never came. The city went quiet after that. For a time. In November of 1892, 1 year after Celeste's death, the rains came harder than anyone could remember. The Mississippi swelled, and the French Quarter streets turned to rivers. The storm flooded the cemeteries, and graves began to open like mouths. Coffins drifted through the streets. The dead came back to visit. When the waters receded, the caretaker of St. Louis Cemetery reported something strange. One grave, Celeste Moreau's, had sunk deeper than the rest. The earth around it was soft and black, as though something beneath had been moving. He said the coffin had shifted. When he tried to open it, he found it empty. He never returned to work. Word spread fast. Some claimed the body was stolen by grave robbers. Others whispered that Celeste had risen, her hunger unending. But in the weeks that followed, the signs grew harder to ignore. A family on Rue Dauphine woke to find their pantry filled with raw meat, dripping, still warm. A market vendor found his entire stall covered in flies, though he'd sold nothing but bread. And one butcher, a man named Baptiste Fournier, vanished after opening a crate of imported pork. Inside his shop, they found his apron folded neatly beside a knife, and a jar filled with pale, floating eyes. The mayor ordered curfews. The churches held vigils, but the sickness only deepened. A rumor began that a secret society had formed, calling themselves Les Disciples de la Chair, the disciples of flesh. They claimed to carry on the Moreau rituals, feeding the city to itself as a kind of purification. At first, no one believed it. But when crates of meat began washing up along the riverbanks, each marked with the initials CM, faith and disbelief began to crumble. By 1893, the French Quarter was dying. The tourists stopped coming. The sailors avoided its docks. The markets that once buzzed with Creole laughter and brass music now smelled of vinegar and smoke. And in the corner of every tavern, someone would whisper, "They say she walks again." One witness, a beggar who slept near Chartres Street, swore he saw her. A lady, he said, dressed in black, face pale as flour, standing in front of the old shop. She had a butcher's hook in her hand, and she smiled at me. Said she was looking for her husband. They found that beggar 2 days later in the alley behind the shop. His body was drained, pale, and carved open like a hog. No blood. No eyes, just the faint smell of cloves and wine. The police closed the file within a week. They said it was a vagrant killing. But old-timers in the quarter began to say otherwise. They said the Moreaus were together again, feeding. That winter, Father Henri Lavigne, the same priest who had buried Celeste, received a letter sealed in wax. It bore no name, only the mark of a cleaver pressed into red wax. Inside was a single sheet of paper and something wrapped in cloth. The paper read, "The city has not learned to fast." Inside, the cloth was a human tongue. Father Henri burned the letter and the tongue in the churchyard furnace that night, but the smell lingered for days. Parishioners said they could smell cooking meat during every Mass, even when the ovens were cold. Terrified, the priest visited the cemetery again, determined to exorcise the grave of Celeste Moreau once and for all. But when he reached the spot, the name had been carved away from the stone. Only one word remained, etched deep into the marble: hunger. He never spoke of it again. Meanwhile, new killings began to mirror the old. Victims found skinned, missing limbs, drained of blood, the marks of a blade too precise to be random. The police, desperate to calm the panic, arrested drifters, sailors, anyone they could. But the killings didn't stop. Instead, they spread. One detective, a man named Antoine Marchand, reopened Rousseau's files and began tracing patterns in the butcher shop records. What he found made his hands shake. The ledgers contained not just names of victims, but dates, weights, and locations. And the pattern didn't end in 1891. It continued, written in a newer hand with fresh ink. The latest entry was dated 3 weeks earlier. It read, "Batch number 47, cathedral order filled. Father Lavigne." That was the night the priest went missing. Antoine went to the cathedral himself. The kitchen smelled faintly of rosemary and iron. In the pantry he found jars labeled "Blessed Oil" that were filled with something thick and dark. On the stove a pot simmered. Inside it floated something pale and unmistakably human. The next morning Antoine resigned. That same week, he drowned himself in the Mississippi. The case files were sealed forever. But legends have a way of crawling through time. Even today, old butchers in New Orleans tell their apprentices never to cut meat after midnight, not because of ghosts, but because the knives go dull when she's near. They say you can still hear her footsteps echoing in the market before dawn, a soft dragging sound like flesh on stone. And if you listen closely, you can hear her humming, that same half-remembered hymn she used to sing while sweeping her shop. Historians argue that the story of Celeste Moreau was exaggerated, that the talk of human meat and rituals was moral panic, born from a city obsessed with sin and redemption. But the official reports, buried deep in the archives of Orleans Parish, tell a quieter truth. The meat samples from the Moreau shop tested positive for something that was not pig, nor cow, nor any known animal. They were human, dozens of them. And one name appears again and again in the margins of those documents, scribbled in different inks over different years: C. Moreau. Some claim it's her ghost, still haunting the city that condemned her. Others say it's not a ghost at all, just hunger passed down, generation to generation, the curse of the butcher's wife. For hunger, as Celeste once said, is the only sin that never dies. And every now and then, when the humidity thickens over the quarter and the smell of rain mixes with spice, someone swears they catch it again, that faint, sweet, metallic scent of cooked flesh, drifting from a shop that hasn't stood for over 100 years. They follow it down Chartres Street, past the ruins, past the alleys where the lanterns flicker. And if they're lucky, they make it back. If not, the city eats again. By the spring of 1894, New Orleans had learned to live with its ghosts. People avoided the French Quarter after sundown. Markets closed before dark, and the butcher stalls, once bursting with laughter and spice, now echoed with silence and the constant drip of melting ice. But hunger doesn't sleep. Not in New Orleans. Not where the dead still whisper through the alleyways. That was when Elias Ward, a journalist from the Picayune, arrived in the city. He was young, Boston-bred, proud of reason and proof, a man who thought superstition was the refuge of the ignorant. He came chasing a story, The Butcher's Curse, a tale that, to him, sounded like the kind of nonsense people invent to sell papers. But when he saw the morgue on Chartres Street, reason began to slip away. Bodies kept appearing, drained, folded pale as wax. No wounds except for a small, circular mark behind the ear, like a puncture, like something had fed. The coroner said rats. But Elias had seen rats, and rats didn't leave their victims clean. One night, as the storm rolled in from the Gulf, Elias sat in his rented room on St. Anne Street, going through police reports. Rain hammered the shutters, thunder shook the window glass, and through the noise, he heard something, faint, rhythmic, tap, tap, like a knife being sharpened. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty, but on the floor, lying neatly in front of his doorframe, was a folded slip of butcher paper. Inside it was a single bone, human, polished clean, and a note written in a woman's elegant hand. The city is still hungry. Elias laughed at first, assuming some cruel prank. But when he brought the bone to the coroner the next morning, the man refused to touch it. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. When Elias told him, the coroner's face went pale. "That house," he said, "was hers. You're sleeping where the Moreaus used to live." He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he began to dig. Through archives, ledgers, confession records, anything bearing the name Moreau. He found that Celeste's husband, Jean Moreau, had been part of a secret organization predating the Civil War, the Order of Saint Flesh, an underground sect that believed consuming human meat preserved the soul of the dead. They called it Sacrament of Continuance. According to an 1867 confession transcript, their rituals took place in the cellars beneath the quarter, accessed through old drainage tunnels built before the flood walls. Their scripture repeated a single phrase: "Those who feed shall not fade." Elias traced the last known ritual site to the ruins of the Moreau shop itself, still boarded up, still standing crooked among modern storefronts like a broken tooth in a new smile. On June 12, 1894, Elias broke in. The floorboards were warped, the air heavy with vinegar and rust. Old hooks still dangled from the rafters, swaying gently as if moved by breath. He brought a lantern, a notebook, and a revolver he'd borrowed from the sheriff. He told himself it was just research. In the back room, he found a trapdoor beneath a rotting butcher table. The hinges screamed when he opened it. Below lay a stairwell that led down, not to earth, but to stone. It was colder there, damp, and smelled faintly of salt and something sweet, like wine. His lantern caught carvings on the wall, old, French prayers mixed with symbols that made no sense, a cleaver crossed with a chalice, a woman's face, a serpent eating its own tail, and below all of it, smeared in what looked like dried blood, Hunger is the only prayer he hears. Elias's breath quickened. He should have left, but then he saw them. Jars, dozens of them, lined on the shelves, sealed tight with wax. Inside, preserved tongues, hands, and faces, some labeled with names, some with dates, and one labeled Rousseau. He stumbled back, dropping the lantern. The flame sputtered, then died, and in the dark, he heard it, that same rhythmic tap. Tap, tap from before, only now it was close, and above it, a voice, soft, female, whispering in perfect calm. "Monsieur Ward, you finally came to eat." The next morning, neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the old butcher shop. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the structure had collapsed inward. No body was found, only the warped remnants of glass jars melted into the floor. But one of them survived, its wax seal untouched. Inside was a page from Elias's notebook. The last line read, "She's not a ghost. She's a hunger that learned to wear a woman's face." By autumn, the killing stopped again. The city exhaled, but the butcher stalls never reopened. The stone foundations of the Moreau shop were covered with new construction. A bakery, then a bar, then nothing. Yet each time a new business moved in, it burned within months. Each time, the owners vanished. Locals began to leave offerings at the site: raw meat, wine, salt. They called it feeding the lady. Even the priests stopped condemning it. Better superstition than blood. And beneath the city, where the old tunnels still breathed, something moved when the offerings came. A sound like breathing, a sigh, a heartbeat. And sometimes, if you dared to listen close enough, a woman humming. They say the Moreau curse runs in blood, that descendants of the original family scattered through Louisiana still feel her pull. When they dream, they see knives. When they cook, their hands shake. And when they pass by Chartres Street, they smell wine and meat. The hunger never died. It simply learned patience. The year was 1901, and New Orleans had once again dressed itself in the illusion of normalcy. Streetcars clattered along St. Charles Avenue. Jazz was beginning to whisper its way through the bars and brothels, and the ghosts of the old quarter hid behind the laughter of tourists and sailors. But the ground remembers. On Chartres Street, the lot where the Moreau butcher shop once stood was finally rebuilt. A small bakery run by a Creole family, the Duvalier. They had no connection to the Moreaus. No dark ancestry, just a dream of fresh bread and good fortune. But fate does not ask for permission. It only waits for the right time to be hungry again. The youngest of the family, Colette Duvalier, was 23, bright, hopeful, a pianist who believed that beauty could heal what history broke. She loved mornings in the bakery, the smell of flour, the glow of ovens, the rhythm of life returning to something ordinary. For a time, it worked. Customers filled the shop, the laughter returned, and for the first time in years, the corner of Chartres Street felt alive again, until the second week of September, when the ovens began to burn without fire. The first sign was small, bread that rose too fast, then split open like flesh. Then came the smell, not rot, not smoke. Something else, something sweet and metallic, like wine spilled on iron. Colette asked her father if a pipe had burst beneath the floor. He laughed it off. But by nightfall, he couldn't breathe. He said he felt as though the air itself was feeding on him. By morning, he was dead. The doctor called it stroke. The neighbors called it justice. Colette buried him quickly and tried to carry on. But the bakery had changed. The walls wept moisture, and no matter how hard she scrubbed, a dark stain kept returning behind the counter, a perfect circle, as if something beneath were bleeding through. At night she heard whispers from the cellar, a woman's hum, soft, patient, almost loving. One evening, unable to take it any longer, Colette went down with a lantern. The cellar was cold, the kind of cold that doesn't belong in the South. The bricks glistened with damp. In one corner, she saw a seam in the wall, a false partition. She pried at it with a knife until it cracked open, and behind it lay a small stone archway, a tunnel. The smell that poured out was old, salt, rust, vinegar, and meat. She should have run, but instead, she stepped inside. The passage led downward, winding like a throat. Her lantern flickered against carvings on the walls, symbols she couldn't read, names she didn't know, until she reached a chamber. There, lit by the trembling light, were shelves lined with glass jars. Inside them floated things she didn't want to understand, and on a table at the center sat an open ledger, its pages inked in brown, thick and clotted. The handwriting was elegant, familiar. Celeste Moreau. Her heart hammered. She flipped through the pages. Each one recorded a name, a date, a confession, and beside every entry, a single phrase, fed to the flock. At the very end, the ink shifted, newer, shakier, written decades after the rest. It read, "To whoever finds this, the hunger is not mine alone. It lives in the hands that bake, in the mouths that eat. You are already part of it." Colette stumbled back, dropping the book. Her lantern fell, rolling across the floor, spilling light on something half buried in the dirt, a cleaver, its blade black with age. When she lifted it, she saw her reflection ripple across it. And another face beside hers, a woman, pale, perfect, smiling. "Don't be afraid," the reflection whispered. "We only feed the willing." Then the lantern went out. The next morning, the bakery was open as usual. Fresh loaves lined the window. Colette stood behind the counter, her hand steady, her smile serene. When a sailor asked for a loaf, she wrapped it in paper and handed it over with a warmth that made him blush. He didn't notice the faint red smudge beneath her fingernail. Nor did anyone else, not that day, nor the week after. Business boomed again. But by winter, whispers returned. People said the bread was different, richer, heavier, impossible to describe. They said it left them hungry no matter how much they ate. And once again, disappearances began. A child here, a drunk there, always near Chartres Street. When the police came to question Colette, the bakery was locked. No answer. They broke the door, found the oven still warm, but empty. The cellar had collapsed into itself, a black pit that seemed to breathe. And on the counter, written in flour, were the words, "The city is still hungry." Signed, Siam. Decades passed. The bakery became ruins, then apartments, then a museum, then nothing at all, but no one stayed. Long the walls always wept, the smell always returned, even today. Locals say if you walk through the French Quarter late enough, past the bars, past the laughter, past the edge of where the streetlights die, you'll find a small, unmarked door between two shops, and behind it, a faint humming, a woman's voice, a knife's rhythm, and the scent of bread and blood. They say she never left, that hunger never dies. It only changes hands. Every meal, every feast, every bite of indulgence, all of it, a quiet worship to something born beneath New Orleans, something that wears a woman's smile and a butcher's grace. And if you ever feel someone watching you in the market, if the meat looks too perfect, if the air feels too warm, if the smell makes your stomach twist with both desire and dread, walk away, because the butcher's wife still feeds. And this time, she knows your name. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out.